Hey, it's Scott Petrak with another episode of the Brown Zone Coverage Podcast. The draft was last weekend, and the Browns picked 9 players, including a kicker, and made 3 trades, not including one involving Baker Mayfield. Dave Chudowsky of the WKYC Morning News, joins me again to discuss the state of the roster and a lot more. Hey, Chud.
Scott, I don't know what the headline is, boring or just what, but it definitely was. I don't know if it was the draft we were expecting. I mean, we knew we didn't have a first round pick, but I don't know. How you doing? How you feeling about it?
Yeah, I think boring qualifies. Kind of my lasting couple impressions, we can get into it a little more, but not a big sense of urgency from the Browns, except when it comes to kicker. You know, they took Cade York in the 4th round at, number 124. That's a little high for a kicker. The earliest the kicker's been taken since 2016. But the Browns didn't want to let him get away, and they felt like that was a spot where they could ensure they would get him. He was the only kicker drafted, so it's safe to assume that other teams had the same scouting report, and he was going to be the one, the first kicker taken. So the Browns did that, and if it's a little early, you can quibble with that, but I understand that they felt like they really needed a kicker, and then they cut their 2 kickers on the roster Monday, so it's his job. And Kevin Stefanski said on the radio there's not going to be competition, so it's all about getting Cade York ready. But outside of him, we knew they didn't have the first-round pick, but then they trade number 44 in the 2nd round, so they don't have a 2nd-round pick. So you're waiting until number 68 in the 3rd round Friday night. And then in the 3rd round Friday night at 68, they take a cornerback, Martin M.J. Emerson. And that was so far down the list of positional needs that it was on the radar because you can never have enough corners. And I'd heard that Kevin Stefanski wanted another corner. But I certainly didn't expect the first pick for the Browns to be a corner, and then they made a couple other trades. So it felt like a team to me, and this is what I wrote after the draft, like that believes it's really good and has a really good roster and doesn't have to chase needs. And instead of picking a Sky Moore or a George Pickens at 44, says, hey, we can get a similar guy at 99 in David Bell, which is what they did because they traded out of 44. So, I don't know if the Browns improved their Super Bowl chances through this draft for 2022. I'm sure they think they got better for the long term. I'm sure think they got better for the short term too. But I don't know if there's a guy in this draft, and there's 9 players outside of the kicker where you say, yeah, this kid's going to come in and start right away. Maybe David Bell, the receiver, maybe Alex Wright, the first edge rusher they took, Perry Winfrey, the D tackle out of Oklahoma. I think they're really pleased to get him at 108. There feels like there's an opening at D tackle, so maybe he can come in and start right away. But even that's not guaranteed. These are kind of competition depth moves, which speaks to the state of their roster. I think it speaks to what they think of their roster. And then the last point I'll get to, Chud, is I don't know, and I wrote this the other day, the questions about the roster are the same to me now as they were before the draft, right? How many times have we talked about, is Jarvis Landry coming back? Is Jadeveon Clowney coming back? What are they going to do at number 2 receiver? What are they going to do at number 2 end? Do they have a stud at D tackle? And yes, they took people at all 3 of those positions, but I'm not sure they took anyone that eliminates those questions. I think those are still questions that a lot of fans are asking.
All right, that's a good summary, and I want to dive into a lot of that a little bit more. But before we do that, we got to talk about the distraction and Baker Mayfield and the trade they didn't make, and that was trading Baker Mayfield. Before I get into the main question, just really quick, are you surprised he's still on the roster? Did you think he was going to get traded, or are you not surprised?
Surprised, but not shocked.
Yeah.
I thought that was such a perfect spot for him to get traded, and the fact that he didn't, I think it's meaningful, right? That felt like the right spot for him to get traded during the draft, and it didn't happen.
So you're on the inside, and it seemed as though, and correct me if I'm wrong. So I know when I was on the air in the morning show, I was asked if he'd be traded on draft night, and I said on the first night, and I said nah. I only had like 10 seconds to answer. It was at the end of the show, and I had just got done telling someone in the office, "Hey, be prepared. He could get traded tonight. He could be traded in a month." That's how I felt. Like I just didn't know. I mean, people expect us to know for sure. I mean, the Browns don't even know. How are we going to know? We can only guess, right? So I just said, you know what? By the end of the weekend, I kind of quickly just thought, I thought he'd get traded by the end of the weekend, not on the first night. So, but I share your exact thought. I'm surprised, but not shocked. So, but the thing is, now they have this major problem. Are they going to regret not trading him over the weekend, and how close did they come? It seemed like, was it Friday night? There was a lot of rumblings that they were close with Carolina.
Yeah, it was Friday night. It was Carolina. There were talks. The reports are that it's all about how much money the Browns are willing to eat from that $18.86 million guaranteed salary for 2022. I keep going back and forth. Like, I really think they need to resolve this. And obviously, Andrew Berry does not feel the same pressure to get it resolved, right? He's willing to let it drag on and just repeat his same answers. And I texted somebody yesterday. He keeps saying it's a fluid situation. Well, if it's so fluid, how come it hasn't changed? It's the same situation. He's not going anywhere. But Andrew Berry, this is my conclusion, is that he feels like if he or the organization, right, it's not his money, but the organization decides to pay whatever the number is necessary, right? If that's 9 or 10 or 15, whatever that number is that will make Baker attractive to other teams. I think Andrew Berry feels like whenever he's willing to do that, he can trade Baker. So in the meantime, you can drive a hard bargain and hope that you get what you want out of the deal, which is giving up less money, right? Paying less of Baker's contract. Like, that's where I kind of feel like Andrew Berry is, because, people say, oh, you got to wait for, now they're waiting for a trade or an injury to happen somewhere else to change the market. First of all, quarterback injuries don't happen all that often. They don't happen until the regular season, right? A guy's not, unless there's something really out of the ordinary. Quarterbacks don't get hurt in the preseason or training camp. They certainly don't get hurt in training camp. Nobody touches them, right? And they hardly ever play in the preseason. So I don't know when this market is going to change. I really don't.
Yeah, and to jump in, I keep hearing that as well. Well, you have two teams that need a quarterback, Seattle and Carolina, and they're not jumping in right now to grab them. So what makes you think, not you, but what makes everyone think that if this guy gets hurt on another team, magically they're just going to want Baker anyway?
I'm with you. And, it's all about leverage, right? And the Browns don't have any leverage because they want to trade him and they have 3 other quarterbacks. So, teams know what position they're in. They know Baker doesn't want to be here, all that. Other teams, Jimmy Garoppolo is still out there, right? Like, Ryan Fitzpatrick is still out there. There's other guys, and, Garoppolo, I think, is pretty similar to Baker in the talent aspect. We've talked about this a billion times. So Carolina, or just pick a team that has a quarterback need, right, can say, well, we can go try to get Jimmy G if you don't take this money off, right? We don't think there's that big a gap from Baker to Jimmy. So that's why they're in a really tough spot. I guess I understand why Andrew Berry continues to drive a hard bargain and says, we're not going to pay whatever that money is, right? Is it half that Carolina wants? Whatever that is. I guess I understand why he is holding out. But having said that, I don't think the market's going to change significantly. They don't want to cut him, right? Because you get nothing back and you eat all the salary. So why not just bite the bullet now? And Andrew Berry's smarter than me, so maybe he forecasts something that I don't. But I feel like Friday, talking to Carolina, after they didn't take a quarterback at 6, they didn't have a pick until the 4th round, or, why not get that done? and they didn't. And now this continues to be a story. Whether or not it's affecting the Browns in Berea, and we could argue whether it is or isn't, I just think it makes more sense to resolve the situation. And now they still have another month plus, 5 weeks before mandatory minicamp. And that's kind of the next thing. Okay, is Baker going to show up? And how do you handle that? And how is he in the building? And what do you ask him to do? And does he practice? And all those questions. It's like June 14th, I think. Right?
Well, so two things real quick.
Yeah.
I guess it makes you wonder how much Carolina really would have wanted him. Like, you'd think that if the team wanted him really bad, they would have gone and gotten him.
No,
I think that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Chud. Except by not making that trade early Friday, you allow no quarterbacks to go off the board outside of Kenny Pickett at number 20 to Pittsburgh. And I think that played into it too, right? All these quarterbacks start to fall. Carolina doesn't have a pick until the 4th round. Well, finally, Carolina says, we could trade up into the 3rd round and draft Matt Corral from Mississippi. And that we like that option better than Baker, right? Not that Carolina, it looks like Carolina's out of the equation, but maybe they're not. Maybe they still want a guy that could come in and start and is better than Sam Darnold. It isn't a rookie 3rd round pick, right? So I don't know if you can completely close the door on Carolina, but there's less leverage for the Browns now because they got their quarterback. And, if the board had fallen different and more quarterbacks had gone up the board earlier, maybe that opens the market up for Baker, but that didn't happen. And the Browns could see that not happening, which you would think would have added to the sense of urgency to get something done and finalize that trade with Carolina.
So, all right, let's talk about this, wrap up Baker, but I want to ask you this. So because there's a lot of reports out there that whether it's a report or an opinion, that and when I say I'm just saying I've heard this multiple places, that people feel they could legitimately see a case where Baker is on this team when the season starts and actually play games for them if they need him. That's out there. So my question to you is, when you're a reporter and you get information, and let's say you get information from inside the building of Berea, you're going to go with that information as if it is true because someone in there told you so, correct? And you're going to believe it? Because you would think that's accurate if you're hearing it.
Yeah, if you trust the person telling you. And
all right, so if you trust them, right? But you can say sources told me. I guess what I'm trying to get to is, are the Browns leading people to believe that this could possibly happen? Because it's hard to imagine, and we've talked about this multiple times. It's hard to imagine that it could possibly happen. Now, we have said you can't rule out anything, so nothing would shock us in the world. But I guess what I'm saying is, are the Browns leading people to believe that it's possible so it helps them trade him or get rid of him? Or is it really feasible that this guy could be on the roster come game day?
I think it's more the former, Judd, is that it helps the Browns to have it out there that they see a scenario where Baker plays for him. If not, then teams would just wait to see him get cut, right? I think it helps the Browns for that to be out there. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't believe it and that Andrew Berry, really feels like, hey, this situation can be resolved to the point where we see that Baker could play if necessary, right? I personally don't think that's a realistic option. Now, I would never rule it out, like you talked about. There is an element that Baker can't just say, screw you guys, I'm not coming in because he forfeits money, or screw you guys, I'm going to sit on the bench, because he's got to find another job somewhere else, right? And maybe it gets to the point where his best opportunity to find another job is to be, come in and do what's asked and do his job like he's getting paid to do. And if that means he's got to play, he's got to play. However, it still feels really far-fetched to me. I think Baker's personality plays into my perception, right? He's not a go along, get along kind of guy. And I think if he wanted to, and I don't know if that's the best thing for him to do or not. But if he wanted to, he could make it really difficult for the Browns by being here, right? He could do interviews. He could sit down with any of us and rip the Browns and do whatever, right? Like, it's just a difficult spot. Now, I don't know if that would serve Baker well. Maybe he'd get the advice that says, hey, just shut up, come in, play, and they're going to trade you at some point, right? The trade deadline's at the end of October or early November, whenever it is. Like, maybe he'll have to have that switch. But I'll tell you what, I don't think that switch has happened. It certainly hadn't happened when he was doing that podcast, right? He expected to be traded, and he was hoping to be traded. And Baker would have to go through a big mental adjustment for him to get to the point where he's going to be in Berea and actually a member of the team. And on top of that, you'd have to use one of your 53 roster spots for him, right? And you already have 3 other quarterbacks. Like, there's a lot of things that tell me he's not going to be on this roster come week 1. The question is he even on this roster come minicamp in June?
Okay. All right. And Scott, I think we'll just finish with this. I mean, we've seen drama ruin the locker room in this team before. So, you have to believe they don't want that to happen again. So I guess we'll continue to watch. Can we move on from Baker now, or do you have any thoughts? All right. So first round, not a surprise they didn't move into the first round. We didn't think they would. And, Andrew Berry basically told us that, and that was the case. Did not see them trading out of the second round, though. I mean, it's kind of surprising to think that you would not have a first or second round pick in the NFL draft when you're, trying to, get to where this team's trying to be with the expectations they have. Now, I get that by trading that pick, they were able to get a couple players that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But boy, oh boy, I mean, you had mentioned Sky Moore and, is there concern here, do you think, that they may have passed up on a guy that could have been a legitimate guy to, be a star in this league and be a factor down the line?
I think there is, Chud. And first of all, yeah, guys like you, there's a difference between 44 and 68. And there's certainly a difference between 44 and 99. And we spent so much time talking about receiver, right? That just we'll focus on that just to start. If it's Sky Moore or George Pickens or one of those guys, I mean, John mentioned the third went the pick after he went at, I think he went at 45 or he went at 45 with the pick that the Browns traded. It's all a blur, right? But so they could have had him, is what I'm saying. They could have had Mechie, they could have had Sky Moore, they could have had George Pickens, just to name 3. So instead, you take a receiver, David Bell, at 99, and maybe it's just perception, but the perception to me is the guy at 44 would have started, right? He's your number 2 guy opposite Amari Cooper. It quiets all talk about, or most of the talk about, Jarvis Landry return, which I don't think is going to happen, period. But do they go get Will Fuller? Do they get a guy like T.Y. Hilton, right? You look at the list of free agents still available. If you take a guy at 44, I think you don't have that conversation anymore, because you have Cooper and then Sky Moore and then Donovan Peoples-Jones and Anthony Schwartz and Jakeem Grant. And right, you have this list and you feel like you have a number 2 because 44 feels like a number 2 receiver. 99, not so much. So from a roster standpoint right now, I think that's newsworthy or noteworthy. I think you always worry about players you pass up. That's a danger of trading down. David Ajabo, we talked about him, the pass rusher out of Michigan. I loved him. I thought if he was there at 44, he made sense for the long term, even though he's coming off Achilles tendon. The Browns decided not. And maybe that's because, they didn't want to give up a year of his 4-year deal to injury. And maybe they didn't love the medical, right? I mean, those would seem the 2 easiest things to point at. But the Ravens took him right after the Browns. So, you look at that and you go, okay, well, I think down the road, you'll look back and go, okay, did Sky Moore turn into a stud? Did David Ajabo wreck the Browns, right? Did he sack Deshaun Watson 4 times in a huge game, right? Those are the kind of things you compare and contrast when you trade out of spots. Even when you draft a guy, right, you draft player A versus player B. But having said that, I was not super surprised at the trade down from 44 because that's who the Browns are philosophically. They're a gather more draft picks kind of organization. And I think we lost a little bit of sight of that when they trade up for JOK in the second round a year ago. Because they're so aggressive with Deshaun Watson and they give up a net of 5 draft picks, you thought, okay, maybe this is a team that's just going to go for it, right? They're going to go out, all out. Maybe they even trade up to get a player. And Andrew Berry and Paul DePodesta are flexible enough to never have a rule set in stone. But they believe if everything's equal, you're better off trading back and getting extra picks because it's such a crapshoot. And I think we saw that this draft, especially at number 44, that they were willing to do that because they valued extra picks. They thought this draft was deeper in the middle rounds. They didn't think there was a huge difference between the player they get at 44 and 68 or 44 and 99. And I think we have to keep that in mind because I think that's just their overall philosophy.
Yeah. Well, and picks are great when you, like you said, you get those middle round picks. But I mean, if you're going to say, well, we had 9 picks, but 3 of them were 6 and 7 round picks, it's kind of like, who cares? I mean, I don't know. How often do 6 and 7 round picks turn out? They do sometimes, but does that make sense or do you disagree?
That makes total sense. Shouldn't I get that? I get that argument. I'm just telling you, I think the Browns in 6th and 7th round picks, you make a great point about that. But even, they picked up a lot of 4th rounders, right? They picked up, I want to say, a 4th and a 5th rounder next year, which they thought was important because they had depleted their future stockpiles with the Deshaun Watson trade. So they really value those. And I know that they value that more than a lot of fans, which is why people are always, before the draft, trade up. And I think you have to remember that this team's default is not to do that, even though you can't rule it out and they'll make exceptions. And if the perfect player had been there at 44, they would have stayed and taken that player. And I don't know who that player would have been. But it obviously wasn't one of the players after 44, and they felt like the drop wasn't that significant. And I think we just have to remember that moving forward because that's their default. That's how they want to lean because they really do value volume.
Well, let's say that David Bell turns out to be a great wide receiver in this league, then the Browns made a good move because they got their receiver later and they got Perrion Winfrey, they get a kicker, and it ends up looking positive on their end. They did the right thing. So, time will only tell on that right now. That's why it's so difficult to know what's going to happen. But I guess that's where I ask you, break down David Bell and tell me, can this guy be, a guy that you're not thinking about those other receivers you passed up? I guess what I'm asking is, could he be I don't know if it's a steal, but I guess the confusion is they passed on a lot of receivers that were ranked higher than him, and he's the first guy they got.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it gets thrown around a lot, value, right? And that's such a nebulous term, but it's all weighed on value. And sometimes that bothers me. It's about players and it's about, is this guy good? And it's about talent. But there is a huge part of the draft is value. So is David Bell plus Perrion Winfrey plus the other pick worth more than Sky Moore, right? Like that's the actual thought process. That's what they're weighing. And the Browns would obviously tell you, yes, we think it is. We think 2 picks in this player is more than 1 player. Now that calculus changes if the player you love is there, right? Which is why you trade up, which is why you sit and take a player, at that spot. It's because you think the value is greater. But specifically about David Bell, he's an interesting guy. I mean, his coaches love him at Purdue. Crazy productive. Bunch of touchdowns, bunch of catches, bunch of yards. He was a Big Ten receiver of the year. He was a national All-American. So you got to like his resume, right? Kevin Stefanski really liked this guy. They believe he can play outside and inside, but there was a lot of discussion during the draft about him playing inside, like being that big slot guy, because he's a taller guy. And they like envisioning him in that role. So he's got great hands. They think he's a good enough route runner to overcome his biggest weakness, and it's a big weakness. He doesn't run well from an NFL receiver standpoint. He ran a 4.65 at the combine. He was even slower at his pro day, like 4.71, I want to say. There's receivers in this league that run high 4.2s, right? So that's a drop. But if you have enough size, if you have enough savvy, if your hands are good enough, if you can make contested catches, which you're going to have to do because you don't outrun many people, you can overcome that. And a great example is Jarvis Landry. He ran a 4.7 coming out of LSU, dropped to the second round, and then was, one of the most productive receivers in history over his first 5 years. I mean, at some point, he had the most catches ever for the first, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years of his career. So that's the question with David Bell. The Browns think that their system and the way they're going to use him will mitigate the lack of breakaway speed. And that's why they liked him. That's why they valued him. They got him at a good spot for him. End of the third round, he was a guy that you heard about, as a third round pick, but to get him toward the end of the round, I think there's a lot of value with that pick. The question is, especially if you're going to play him in the slot, then who's your number two? And I keep going back to this because this is one of the unresolved things coming out of the draft. Right now, it's probably Donovan Peoples-Jones. Is your opening day lineup right now, and I know there's plenty of time left before opening day, before week one, but is Amari Cooper, Donovan Peoples-Jones outside, David Bell inside, and then you work in Anthony Schwartz and Jakeem Grant as these change of pace guys? Can you live with that? Is that good enough? Is that receiving core good enough to compete with the other high-powered teams in the AFC? And I don't know if the Browns feel that it is. I think they'll still look at guys like Will Fuller and maybe T.Y. Hilton, and there's other guys out there. Deshaun Jackson's still available. So I don't know the answer. I think, again, it comes down to money, right? Can they get the guy they want at the right contract? Because obviously they're not willing to pay Jarvis Landry the money that he would want to return after they cut him, right? That's if they were, he'd be back on this team, I believe. So it's interesting. I think, and the same thing holds true for defensive end and to almost a similar degree, defensive tackle. Andrew Berry's thrown bodies at these problems, whether it's free agent signings that go under the radar and whether it's draft picks, right? They also took Michael Woods II, a receiver out of Oklahoma. They doubled up and took another defensive end out of Oklahoma, Isaiah Thomas, after they took Alex Wright out of UAB. My point is there's a lot of people in all these positions. The question is the second guy in all these positions good enough to be your starter week one and good enough to say, yes, we can compete against the best in the AFC with Alex Wright or Stephen Weatherly at defensive end or David Bell and Donovan Peoples-Jones at receiver? And that's a question that I don't know the answer to, but I think it's going to continue to be asked until Andrew Berry does something else at one of these key positions.
Martin Emerson Jr., the first pick of the draft for the Browns in the third round. I got to tell you, I think that if that would have happened and that was a top 10 pick or the first round or early second round, it'd been more annoying to me to pass on a position of need. But being that it was in the third round and they already kind of changed the direction they were going anyway, I don't know if I have a problem with this if this guy works out, because like we've talked about many times, you can never have enough corners in this league. And because of, the fact that Ward gets hurt so much, if this guy pans out, I think we might be okay with it. Although I understand if someone complains that they didn't go to position of need. Again, I stick to my original point that it would have hurt me more if it was, pick 18 in the first round.
I completely get that. I think that's a great point, Chud. I think that's a sign of not drafting into the third round, like you just said. I think it's a feeling of liking your roster and feeling you don't have to force a guy at a certain position. I think it's valuing that position greatly, just independently and in an AFC loaded with big-time quarterbacks. They love his size, and you know, we talk about the Browns not being in absolutes, and David Bell points that out, right? They want fast, tall guys. Like, they have their prototypical players in mind, and then they can depart from it once in a while and stray. And David Bell running a 4.6 is a departure from their ideal receiver. But Martin Emerson, like, has the body type of their ideal cornerback, right? He's like 6'2", 200 pounds. Like, that's the kind of cornerback that they look at. And we talk about those spark scores where, it's how fast and tall and all the athletic things that a guy brings. And they pay a lot of attention to those things. And I understand why they pay a lot of attention to those things. But so that's one of the, I think that plays into why they would draft a corner when they don't really need one, But it's interesting. You'd say, oh, well, we can never have enough, which is what Kevin Stefanski said. Well, then the next day they turn around and trade Troy Hill, right? So they obviously felt like they had one extra, They got back with the 5th round pick, in 2023, right, from Troy Hill. So I think that was a trade, it all blends together. But so it's just interesting, right? Obviously they felt they could move on from Troy Hill. Martin Emerson allows them to do that. Now, are they going to ask Greg Newsome to start on the outside and then move inside to the nickel when teams go 3 wides? Like he did that some of last year. That's a big ask. There's not a lot of guys in this league that do that. But right now, that seems like the logical thing because Emerson's more of an outside corner. Denzel Ward's not a slot guy. Greedy Williams certainly is not a slot guy. I don't know if AJ Green is. So, I don't know if there's another option on the roster right now besides Greg Newsome being your number 1 slot guy. And then you would assume also starting outside, given he was a number 1 pick last year, given that he played well. It's just interesting that they would spend that pick on that position and then trade a guy that they didn't need to trade that I thought played pretty well last year that is a slot corner. It's just interesting that they would do that. But I'm with you. Once you make that move in the 3rd round, it has less impact to it. And again, I think it's a feeling of we really like a lot of players on this team, and we can go get a player we really like, even though it's not a big position to need.
So on Monday morning on the morning show, they asked me to, do a segment to summarize the draft, hit the, you only have a certain amount of time. You got to hit the main topics, and they wanted basically 3 takeaways. And, I started out just by saying, hey, they didn't pick in the 1st. They traded their 2nd round pick. They took a cornerback with their 1st pick, not a position of need necessarily. But then my 3 bullet points were in no certain order. Baker Mayfield still on the team, right? The fact that they drafted a kicker, right? And then my 3rd thing was I had to show the soundbite from Perry on Winfrey. Had to. I mean, how many fans did that guy just get?
My God, how good was that? I mean, talk about. I was going to take credit because I think I asked the first question, and it was just, were you just, kind of, did you think the Browns were going to take you? And, it was kind of long. It had been a long draft for you. Did you think you were going to go Friday, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, and he just starts with this is a wake-up call I needed and all the fuel and fire I'll ever need. It's like, oh, my gosh. And he just went on and on. But then every question he got, he answered just as well. So it had nothing to do with the question I asked. Quickly came to realize that.
So that was, I didn't realize that was your question that brought that out.
Just to kick it off. Yeah, just like the first question kicked it off, and then he was nonstop from there, right? Myles Garrett, he was great about playing next to Myles Garrett. So, but yeah, I talk about the energy that guy had. And, you talk to people or you read about him. I haven't talked to his coaches yet from Oklahoma. I have made calls, but the energy he brings it's not just in interviews, right? It's on the practice field. Like the Browns talked about how you can feel his energy. And it was at the Senior Bowl, it was a practice at Oklahoma. So it doesn't feel like it's, fake at all. It feels like that's just who he is. So it'll be interesting that, the Browns could use a guy like that with that kind of energy. Now, he still needs to play well, and he needs to be able to stand up against double teams, and he needs to be able to penetrate the pocket from the interior because that's what the Browns are looking for in their defensive tackles. But he added some buzz, right? Because it was, I mean, we talked about it. The draft lacked a lot of buzz. And I thought to start off a long Saturday, you get 4 rounds of draft picks and the Browns are taking like 6 guys. For Perry Winfrey to start Saturday, and it was, we probably talked to him before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, really sent a jolt through the draft, and that was appreciated.
So I know that this is going to be dissected big time throughout the year, next year, for the upcoming years. And I'm sure there's going to be a guy that they passed on that people say, oh, they could have had him. But, Scott, where do you stand and lie in the Cade York pick? I don't have a problem with it. I'm going to tell you why. Now, is it early in the 4th round? It is. But if they felt like, and you mentioned it earlier, that they couldn't get him later and they knew this was the guy, I don't have a problem with it. I'm tired of watching this team fail and make mistakes and lose games because they don't have a kicker. And if this is the guy that can turn it around, and I know it's not a guarantee, but you know what? Why not take the shot? Because I've seen a lot of 4th round picks get drafted. Everyone's excited about them, and then they just suck. So why not? Why not take the shot?
I think that all makes sense, John. I think that's what the Browns are thinking. And they certainly felt like kicker was a spot that they could no longer ignore. Not that they ignored it, but they hadn't drafted. Well, they didn't draft a guy last year, but they drafted Austin Seibert. Like, they tried to figure out kicker, and they just weren't successful. And they felt like this was the best way to address it. And they like having kickers on a rookie contract, as opposed to going spending a bunch of money on a free agent. And they feel like they got the best one you could get in the draft. And Cade York's got a big leg. I talked to his coach at LSU the other day, who just raved about his mental approach and how he'll handle the weather, and how, he'll talk to Phil Dawson to figure out the, vagaries of the stadium, because it's a difficult place to kick in, and the rest of the AFC North, stadiums. Heinz Field obviously is a tough place to kick, but he'll do everything necessary to be successful. And so they liked everything about him. They liked his leg, they liked his height, they liked his mental makeup. So yeah, I'm with you. If he turns out to be a disaster, right? And you never know with the kicker. The last one that was taken this high was Robert Aguayo from the Bucs in the 2nd round, and he lasted 1 year, right? So you just don't know. They're so far from a sure thing that I understand the philosophy to not even draft one. Because if you sign a guy, there's a randomness to kicker. Having said that, I think where the Browns are, again, from a roster standpoint, like, they expect to be really good, which means you're going to play a lot of important games. And those games come down to kicks a lot of times. And you want to have confidence in that guy. And the Browns got to a point where they didn't have that confidence in Chase McLaughlin, right? And we've seen it. And when you lose confidence in a kicker, that's when you got to cut bait. And we saw it happen early. It was like week 2, right? With Austin Seibert that 1 year, I think, or Zane Gonzalez. They all run together. But I remember guys missing kicks in New Orleans and getting cut. And the fact is, once you've lost that as a coach, as in an organization, it's really difficult to get back. And if you're not really invested in that player, he's a he's a 7th round pick, or he's a free agent guy, it's easy to move on from that. And if you have a 4th round pick that you're invested in, I think the guy's got a longer leash, number one. But it just gives you some confidence if that's what you're looking for, right? They're looking for a guy that Kevin Stefanski feels like, hey, in the 4th quarter, this guy can go win me the game. And I think just virtue of his resume to this point, virtue of where you drafted him, that's how the Browns are approaching with Cade York. And at some point, they didn't have that with Chase McLaughlin. And it's a whole different way to live with your kicker. So I'm with you. I think ideally you don't take a kicker that high, but I think the circumstances were special, including he was the best and no other kicker got drafted, right? So therefore, there's a drop-off from him to whether it's Dicker from Texas or Burkich, who grew up in Chardon and kicked at NDCL and then played at Oklahoma. Those guys are good chances to kick in this league, but they weren't drafted. So I don't have a big issue with the Browns, quote unquote, reaching to go get their guy in an important position.
Yeah. You make me a little nervous when you bring up those names of the guys that failed that were drafted high, but all right. two more things, and then I'm done. Quickly, don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but Jerome Ford, do you like that pick, and what does that mean for the future at the Browns with the running game?
Yeah, I mean, they like his speed, right? They think he adds an element to that backfield, but I don't love that pick, Judd, because I think that, again, is a position of strength. To me, it just means somebody else isn't going to be here when we get to week 1. And whether that's trading Dearness Johnson, whether that's trading Kareem Hunt, to me, those are the two options, right? I don't think you draft Ford where you did and say, and not make another move. I think there's a domino effect to this move. The Browns won't come out and say it. We love depth. We want to go to training camp with a lot of talent. I understand that, but and I don't think there's a rush to trade anybody, but I'd be stunned if the Browns open week 1 with Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt, Dearness Johnson, Jerome Ford, and Demetric Felton on the roster. And cutting Demetric Felton at the end of camp doesn't change that equation to me at all. So it's all about Dearness Johnson and Kareem Hunt. And I think, you can live with 3 running backs, right? So Demetric Felton then could be your 4th. So I guess my point is, I think it means we're going to see a change at running back. And the question is, do we see Dearness Johnson or Kareem Hunt gone? Both guys are entering the last year of their contracts. Kareem Hunt signed he signed a 2-year, $12 million deal a couple of years ago. Dearness Johnson, the Browns tendered him as a restricted free agent. I don't even think he's officially signed that tender yet. But once he does, then the Browns could trade him. So it just feels like another move's coming. Would you agree with that?
It does. Yeah. I mean, it does. It's hard to imagine they'd keep all those running backs. And let's see. What was Ford again? What round? He was 5th.
I want to say 5th. Yeah.
So how do you I don't know. Is that kind of in the middle? Like if you pick him in the 3rd or 4th round, you think, oh, well, they're definitely not going to want to not have this guy in the roster. But if he's in the 6th or 7th, it's kind of like, where do you, is that kind of middle, like no man's land there in the 5th?
Yeah, it was a 5th. Yes, but I would say for a running back, I think that means he's on the team.
Yeah, right.
Right, because running backs you can get later in the draft. We've seen that a billion times, and not that you couldn't see him in mini camp and training camp and say, hey, this guy's just not good enough. We'll go with who we have. But it feels like the Browns, at the least, are leaving the option open to, if another team says, hey, we want one of your running backs, the Browns will be like, okay, that's fine. We'll trade him for whatever, whether it's a player at a specific position, whether it's more draft capital in the years to come, right, which we talked about. It just feels like that. Obviously Nick Chubb's going to be here, but after that, Kareem Hunt's coming off injuries, and it's the first time he's ever missed games with injuries. So, I don't think that should be like a damning thing that, oh my gosh, he missed injuries, we got to get rid of him. But you can see a scenario which, if a team really wanted him, that the Browns would be like, okay, we can give him up. Dearness Johnson played so well when Kareem Hunt was hurt, right? Or if a team wants Johnson because he's cheaper, the Browns can say, okay, we'll trade him because we have Kareem Hunt. Now we have Ford. We also have Felton, and we can get something back for Dearness Johnson when he's going to become an unrestricted free agent, and we probably won't be able to pay him what another team would pay him. So I understand, I understand the move by the Browns, but it just brings up questions. And just a final point on Hunt, he's so good, right? When he's healthy and playing, Kareem Hunt has such an impact, including in the running game, that I would be hesitant to give him up. And maybe Andrew Berry is too. Maybe this is all about Dearness Johnson.
Yeah.
But I'd be really hesitant to trade Kareem Hunt because I just don't think you're going to get the value back in a trade for what he can give you on the field when you're trying to make a run at the Super Bowl.
Yep. All right, last thing. I'm done talking. Anything else on the draft that you want to throw out there?
Nope.
All right, last two. I'll ask you two different topics in one question, and you can go wherever you want. We can put the Hugh Jackson thing to bed, and any comments on the possible front office talk out there.
Chud, this is why you're the best. Those are the other two notes I had. I wanted to make sure we talked about kicker, and then I wrote down tanking and Catherine Raish, if I'm not butchering her name. Let's start with her. Yeah, the Browns are going to try to hire her for a big time job in the personnel department, and it would, she's the highest ranking woman in the personnel departments right now with the Eagles. I think it's vice president of player personnel, but I should look that up. But regardless, it's a huge job, and she would have a better job here, right? A better title, you would think. Coming to Cleveland, leaving Philadelphia. So vice president of football operations was the job she held with the Eagles. So it's interesting. Andrew Berry worked with her in Philadelphia in 2019, the 1 year that he wasn't with the Browns. Become kind of a mentor for her. I know he's really impressed with her. She was a lawyer in Canada and left law to be in sports and worked in the Canadian Football League for 5 years, worked her way up, and then took the job with the Eagles. So it's interesting. And we talked about this before just for a second before we started the podcast. I'm conflicted about some of this because the Browns have been really good in diversity, right? Callie Brownson, the chief of staff for Kevin Stefanski, and now she's assistant receivers coach. They have other women inside the organization, inside the scouting department. Megan Rock is one of them. You see her a lot on that Building the Browns show. I believe that the Browns believe in diversity. I believe that Paddy Podesta does, and Andrew Berry does, and it's whether it's gender or race or background. I don't think that that's just lip service. But I don't know how you look at this move, which the Browns are hoping to make. It's not official, but they're hoping to hire her. I don't know how you look at that move without thinking somewhat about the Deshaun Watson trade, right? Is how do you value women to this degree, but it seems contradictory and conflicting to trading for, giving up a bunch of draft picks and paying, which are really secondary issues. Trading for is the biggest issue. A guy who was accused by 24 women of sexual misconduct, and many of those, or at least a few of those, are really serious allegations. So I think that's something that we're going to have to talk to the Browns about. And do they feel like it's a conflict? And I know that they got comfortable with the Deshaun Watson move. But I still think that those kind of moves are difficult to reconcile, in my opinion. Now, that's nothing to do with Catherine, right? And I should say Catherine because I don't want to butcher how to pronounce her last name. It's got nothing to do with her, right? But organizationally, I just don't know how you get around wondering about that.
What name? Raish's name or?
Yeah, Raish's name. I just don't want to butcher her last name.
Yeah, right. Okay. And it's definitely, just to echo off what you said, I have to believe there are a lot of fans that thought of that when when the word came out. So like you said, you guys, beat writers and reporters, will address that when the time comes. So Hugh Jackson before we go, or do we? Yeah.
I mean, let me ask you first, Judd. Are you just so sick of this? The Hugh Jackson tanking, whatever?
Oh, Hugh Jackson tie goes to the runner with Baker Mayfield. So, absolutely. The guy is, it's incredible how he brought himself back into the spotlight. But I think all he did was damage himself even more. It's hard to believe Hugh Jackson could damage himself even more.
Right.
So
yeah, I think that's a great point, Judd. My thoughts on it are, so the league comes out and says we did an investigation into Hugh's, incentivized losing. We don't think there's substantial evidence to support his claims, clear the Browns, which, I think was to be expected. The Browns felt confident this whole time, categorically denied his allegations. Jackson had backpedaled publicly from, yeah, they paid me to, well, there's this bonus to, there's this bonus structure. So it was a cloudy situation. I expected the NFL to come and side with the Browns, which, it's the NFL supporting the NFL owners. So, I know it's an independent investigation, but still, like, you just wonder, how authentic that is in the ruling. But whatever, you could see that coming. And part of that is I don't find Hugh Jackson trustworthy at all. And I think there's a lot of people around that don't either. And I think the league would feel that way. I think an investigator would probably feel that way, even though he did not talk to the investigator. He chose not to. But what was interesting is that Sports Illustrated got a bunch of files, assumingly from Hugh Jackson. They got a bunch of files about the case. And one of those was a chart of the 4-year plan and the bonus structure that some of the members of the front office and Hugh Jackson, how they would get paid given certain things, right? And the Browns called it their 4-year plan. In 2016 and 2017, there was no mention of winning, right? There were bonuses for, if developing quarterbacks or having, this specific type of quarterback. They, a lot of it's analytics driven is, okay, does he do this and what have you? It was about having young roster. It was about having a bunch of draft picks. You got rewarded for that. It was about having saving salary cap space that you could roll over. All kinds of things that are about rebuilding, right? And I guess the biggest thing here is, where's the line between rebuilding and tanking, right? And I think the Browns were smart enough to make sure that they stayed on the rebuilding line as opposed to crossing over to the tanking line. And I think they knew that. And I think when they put all this stuff together, they knew there'd be questions, and they stayed on the, we're going to call it rebuilding. We're not going to make it look like we're tanking. We're not going to purposely lose games. We're just making sure we're young in this and set up to win in 2018, right? And we can argue whether or not that's a good thing, right? The team should go through this kind of rebuilding. Should you always be trying to win as many games as possible? But that's how, it's not only the Browns. Plenty of teams across professional sports do that, right? There's a tear down and then a rebuild. But if you look at this bonus structure, what jumps out is that in 2018 and 2019, because there's a 4-year plan, all of a sudden there's incentives for winning. And it's getting 10 wins. It's finishing at least second in the AFC North. It's being, a top whatever team when it's talking about Super Bowl expectations. So, if you're Hugh Jackson, you argue, well, for 2 years, there were no incentives in these contracts to win. And I think that's noteworthy, right? And I understand how you would make that argument. I also understand that if you're the Browns, you say, hey, we covered ourselves because, for 2 years, it was rebuilding with the goal of winning in 18. That doesn't mean we tried to lose in 16 and 17. Does that make sense?
It does, totally. I can't really add more to that. I think it seems pretty logical to me. I think you summed it up well.
So hopefully this is it. All right. Hopefully Hugh's done talking.
Right.
He keeps threatening this book. We'll see if that ever happens. And I do believe that Hugh, at some level, didn't expect it to be as bad as it was, right? 1-15, 0-16. Obviously, he did not expect that. And he felt like he looked around and said, man, this roster's terrible. But there was more to it than that, right? There was bad coaching decisions. You can't get around that. There was bad personnel decisions. Like, even if they wanted all these picks, and even if they wanted to roll over salary cap space, which they did all those things, which set them up for the future and gave them extra draft picks and was part of this obvious rebuild. They blew with Robert Griffin III, right? Like, Hugh loved him, thought the earth moved during his workout, and then he came in and got hurt and wasn't good, right? Like, so the winds change if you get that quarterback right. You could say the same about like Deshaun Kaiser. Like, they got that wrong. Cody Kessler, that pick was terrible, but I don't think they made that pick hoping to lose. I just think it was a bad pick. Corey Coleman, right? Like, there were a bunch of bad decisions on personnel made,
Trust me.
which
Trust me.
compounded the fact that they didn't sign a couple big free agents that they could have signed, right? They let Mitchell Schwartz go and Alex Mack. Like, those are moves that we hated at the time and probably were part of this, hey, we're going to be bad for a while, so we don't need to spend money on a right tackle. And that's tough if you're a fan. It's tough if you're a season ticket holder spending a bunch of money and you go 1-31. But they didn't have to be 1-31 if they coached better and if they made better roster decisions, right? Which I think in the end is why Sashi Brown's not here, is because the roster decisions weren't good enough. And we know why Hugh's not here. It's because the coaching wasn't good enough. And the coaching wasn't good enough, especially in that first half of 2018, where they felt like they could win games, and he goes 2-5-1.
Trust me. Remember the trust? What isn't that what he kept saying? Trust me with Cody Kessler.
He said, "Trust me a lot."
Yeah,
Hugh was a Hugh, the Hugh years.
Well, I say we end it there, Scott. I got to get a nap.
Yeah, I hear you, Chud. Appreciate the time.
Absolutely,
good
that's
talk.
fun, man. I got to tell you, tons of information here. Very informative. Nice work, man.
Thanks, bud. Go get your nap. Go coach some girls softball. Hopefully the weather holds out for you. And thank you, everybody, for listening. This has been another episode of the Zone Coverage Podcast. You can read all my work at brownzone.com. Thanks a lot.